What secrets hide behind the heavy wooden doors of a medieval castle as twilight falls? How did the most privileged women of the Middle Ages prepare for sleep in a world without electric lights, central heating? What rituals, fears, and comforts shaped their nights in ways that would seem almost alien to us today? Welcome, dear listeners, to another journey through the quietly fascinating corridors of history. Before we begin tonight's exploration into the intimate evening world of medieval noblewomen, I'd love to know where you're joining us from tonight. What time is it in your corner of the world? Are you settling in for the evening? Perhaps preparing for your own bedtime ritual? If you find yourself drawn to these quiet historical journeys, if these boring history stories bring you the peace and fascination you're seeking, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support truly means everything to our growing community of history lovers who find comfort in the past. And please, take a moment to comment below about what historical topic you'd like us to explore next. You are such an important part of what makes this community special, and I'm genuinely grateful for your continued support. Now, as we prepare to step back nearly 8 centuries, you might want to dim the lights around you. Perhaps turn on a fan for some gentle background noise, and let yourself settle into the slower rhythm of medieval time. Close your eyes if you wish, and let your imagination carry you to a world where the day's end was marked not by the click of a light switch, but by the gradual fading of firelight and the distant tolling of chapel bells. The year is 1348, and you are Lady Eleanor de Montfort, wife to a powerful baron whose lands stretch across 3 counties in the English countryside. As the last rays of autumn sunlight filter through the narrow windows of your private solar, you feel the familiar weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders. But your evening is far from simple, and your journey to sleep will be nothing like the quick routine of modern times. You have survived another day in a world where your every movement is observed, where your behavior reflects not just on yourself, but on your entire family's honor, and where the simple act of preparing for bed requires the coordination, complex rituals, and careful attention to both spiritual and physical needs. Tonight, like every night, the first sign that evening approaches comes not from a clock, but from the changing quality of light streaming through your chamber's windows. The thick glass, filled with bubbles and imperfections, casts wavering patterns on the stone walls as the sun begins its descent. You've learned to read these subtle shifts like a natural timepiece. Your ladies-in-waiting have been anticipating this moment. Lady Margaret, your most trusted companion and daughter of a lesser noble family, approaches with the quiet deference that marks all interactions in your world. Behind her, 2 younger women, barely past their own girlhood. These aren't servants in the modern sense, but daughters of noble families sent to your household. The first task is the careful removal of your day clothes, and this alone is a complex undertaking that reveals just how different medieval life was from our modern assumptions. Your outer gown, made of rich wool dyed in deep blue and trimmed with imported silk. The fabric is so precious that it represents months of a common labourer's wages. Lady Margaret's hands move with practiced precision as she loosens the tight lacing that has held the gown's shape throughout the long day. Beneath this outer layer You wear a fitted undertunic of fine linen, and beneath that, the chemise, which you'll keep on throughout the night, is your most intimate piece of clothing, and it carries the accumulated scents and textures of your daily life. Medieval people rarely bathed in the way we understand bathing. Cleanliness was maintained through frequent changes of linen and careful attention to the parts of the body that could be easily washed. As your outer garments are carefully folded and stored in your great wooden chest, you become acutely aware of how the stone walls seem to exhale the day's accumulated cold. Even in the height of summer, these thick walls maintain a chill that seeps into your bones. As the sun set, tonight, with autumn well advanced, the cold seems to press against the tapestries hanging on your walls. Seeking entry to your private space, your ladies begin the process of preparing your evening fire. But this isn't simply a matter of striking a match. Fire is precious, dangerous, and requires constant attention. The great fireplace in your chamber burns oak logs that have been seasoning for 2 years, cut from trees on your husband's lands and transported here. The wood must be arranged just so, with kindling and tinder, prepared by servants who understand that a poorly managed fire could mean the difference between comfortable sleep and a night of shivering beneath heavy furs. While the fire builds, casting dancing shadows, you participate in the evening's washing ritual. This isn't the full-body bathing that occasionally takes place in your household, but rather a careful cleansing of hands, face, and feet. Lady Margaret pours warm water from a brass ewer into a matching basin. The water itself tells a story of medieval life's complexities. It has been heated over the kitchen fires, carried up narrow stone stairs by servants, and tested to ensure it's the proper temperature. Too hot, and it could scald your skin. Too cold, and it would be an unpleasant shock. The soap, a luxury that marks your high status, is made from rendered animal fat. It creates very little lather compared to modern soaps, and its texture is rough against your skin. As you wash, your ladies attend to your hair, and this process alone reveals the elaborate nature of medieval beauty standards. Your hair, which has been pinned and covered throughout the day, according to the strict rules governing married women's appearance. The brush itself is a work of art, carved from ivory and set with boar bristles. Each bristle individually placed by a craftsman who specialized in such luxury items. Medieval hair care involved no shampoos or conditioners, but rather careful brushing to distribute the natural oils from scalp to ends, and the occasional application of herbal rinses made from rosemary. Your hair never cut short. According to medieval custom for women of your class, the brushing ritual takes nearly an hour, during which Lady Margaret works systematically, carefully teasing out any tangles that are formed during the day's activities. During this time, you review the day's events and plan for tomorrow's responsibilities. As the lady of this castle, you've spent today overseeing the household accounts, mediating disputes between servants, planning meals for the next week, and receiving reports from the various officials who manage your husband's estates. Tomorrow will bring similar responsibilities, complicated by the fact that your husband is currently away, attending to his duties at court, leaving you to manage thousands of acres. The mental weight of these responsibilities doesn't simply disappear. When evening comes, medieval noblewomen carried enormous pressure. responsible not just for household management, but for maintaining the complex web of relationships that kept medieval society functioning. A single mistaken judgment could have consequences that rippled through generations, affecting not just your own family, but the many families who depended on your household for their livelihoods. As your hair is finally arranged in a long braid suitable for sleeping, this isn't dinner, which was served earlier in the day, but rather a light repast designed to sustain you through the long night ahead. Medieval dinner was typically served in the mid to late afternoon, and the evening meal, sometimes called supper, consisted of simpler foods that were believed to aid sleep and digestion. Tonight's offering includes white bread, a luxury that demonstrates your status. There's also aged cheese from your own dairy, made by servants who have perfected the art of cheese making. A cup of watered wine, warmed with spices and honey, completes the meal. The wine helps ward off the night's chill and is considered healthier than water, which in medieval times often carry diseases that could prove fatal. As you eat, your ladies prepare your bed, and this process reveals just how different medieval sleeping arrangements were from modern expectations. Your bed is not simply a mattress and sheets, but rather a complex construction designed to provide warmth and comfort. The base consists of a wooden frame with rope supports, over which lies a mattress stuffed with wool from your own sheep, mixed with fragrant herbs. Over this lies a feather bed, a luxury item filled with down from geese and swans, covered with linen sheets that have been washed with soap and dried in the sun to achieve the whiteness that medieval people associated with cleanliness and purity. The sheets themselves represent weeks of work by skilled seamstresses, as the linen was spun from flax grown on your estates, woven by specialists, and cut. The bed coverings consist of multiple layers, each serving a specific purpose. First comes a light woolen blanket, then heavier covers, made from furs. Finally, the great coverlet, a masterpiece of medieval textile art, and embroidered with scenes from romance, literature, or religious stories, provides both warmth and a display of your family's status. As the final preparations for sleep begin, you kneel before your private altar, a small but exquisitely crafted space that houses precious religious items, a book of hours illuminated by skilled monks, and small relics of saints that are believed to provide protection during the vulnerable hours of sleep. Medieval people understood sleep as a time when the soul was particularly exposed to spiritual dangers. Your prayers tonight include gratitude for the day's blessings, requests for protection for your husband during his travels, appeals for the health and prosperity of your household, and the complex petitions that reflect your position as lady of the manor. You pray for the souls of your deceased children. For medieval infant mortality means that most noble families have experienced the loss of at least one child. You pray for wisdom in tomorrow's decisions, for the strength to fulfill your duties, and for peaceful sleep free from the nightmares that medieval people believed could be sent by evil spirits. As you finally approach your bed, Lady Margaret performs the last ritual of the evening, checking the chamber one final time to ensure your safety and comfort. She confirms that the fire has been properly banked to provide warmth without risk, that the shutters are securely fastened against the night air. For medieval castle plumbing consists of garde-robes built into the walls, The final moments before sleep bring their own particular challenges and comforts. As you settle beneath the heavy covers, you're acutely aware of the sounds that mark medieval night. The footsteps of night watchmen making their rounds, the settling creaks of the ancient wooden beams that support your chamber roof, and the occasional call of an owl from the castle courtyard. The life and nightly fears of Marguerite de Navarre. As you drift deeper into the world of medieval sleep, let your mind wander now to another time, another castle, where the flickering candlelight illuminates a story of remarkable courage and quiet determination. We leave behind Lady Eleanor's English castle and travel to the court of France, to the chambers of a woman whose nightly preparations were shadowed by political intrigue. In the winter of 1527, in the opulent but draughty chambers, Marguerite de Navarre prepared for what she feared might be one of her final nights as a free woman. Sister to King Francis I of France, wife to the King of Navarre, and one of the most powerful women in Europe, Marguerite's bedtime routine this particular evening carried the weight of international politics, religious revolution. Marguerite was no ordinary noblewoman. At 45 years old, she had survived court intrigue that had claimed the lives of lesser players, had negotiated with emperors and popes, and had written poetry that challenged the very foundations of medieval religious thought. But tonight, as her ladies helped her from her court, she carried the knowledge that her brother's latest military adventure had failed spectacularly. Leaving France, the candlelight in her chamber revealed a woman whose face showed the accumulated stress of a life lived at the very center of European politics. Marguerite's evening preparations began, as always, with the careful removal of the elaborate court costume that marked her status as both French princess and Queen of Navarre. This wasn't simply clothing, but armor of a sort, each piece carefully chosen to communicate messages and political allegiances to the dozens of observers who watched her every public moment. Her outer robe, stiff with gold thread and precious stones, required the assistance of 3 ladies to remove safely. The fabric itself told the story of global trade routes that connected her French court to silk producers in distant China, to gold miners in the New World colonies, and to gem cutters in the Italian city-states. But beneath this magnificent exterior lay the same basic layers worn by noble women, the linen chemise and the various undergarments that created the fashionable silhouette demanded by court standards. As her ladies worked to unlace the tight bodice that had compressed her torso throughout the long day of court appearances, Marguerite allowed her mind to drift to the events that had brought her to this moment of particular vulnerability. Her brother, Francis, the king, she had spent her life, had been captured by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V at the Battle of Pavia nearly 2 years earlier. The king's release had come at an enormous cost, including territorial concessions that weakened France. The evening washing ritual that followed carried special significance for a woman in Marguerite's position. Water, heated in the castle's kitchens and carried up the winding stone stairs, was tested not just for temperature but for purity. In an age when poisoning was a common method of political assassination, every aspect of Marguerite's daily routine required careful attention to security. The silver basin used for washing wasn't chosen merely for its beauty. As warm water flowed over her hands and face, Marguerite reflected on the dangerous path she had chosen to walk. Unlike many noble women of her era, she had embraced the new religious ideas flowing from Germany. where Martin Luther's challenges to Catholic authority were reshaping the spiritual landscape of Europe. Marguerite's own religious writings, circulated discreetly among trusted friends, advocated for reforms that the Catholic Church considered heretical. Her evening prayers would include not just the traditional Latin invocations, but also personal meditations in French. The process of preparing her hair for the night revealed another layer of the complexity, as her most trusted lady-in-waiting, Marie de Montmorency, carefully removed the elaborate headdress required by court protocol. Marguerite's greying brown hair fell loose around her shoulders. The headdress itself, a masterpiece of goldsmith work, encrusted with pearls and precious stones. It represented political alliances, as each significant jewel had been chosen to honor a particular noble family. The brushing of her hair, a ritual that took nearly an hour each evening, provided Marguerite with one of the few times in her day when she could speak freely with Marie, who had served her family for over 20 years and whose loyalty had been tested. As the ivory brush worked through her hair, Marguerite shared her concerns about the growing religious tensions that threatened to tear France apart. She spoke in whispers about the secret meetings she had been hosting for scholars and reformers who sought to bring new religious ideas to France, without triggering the violent reactions that had already begun in other parts of Europe. These gatherings, held in the privacy of her chambers, or in remote corners of her estates, the Catholic Church wielded enormous political power, and accusations of heresy could destroy even a royal princess if her enemies managed to gather sufficient evidence. Tonight's conversation carried particular urgency. Marguerite had received disturbing news about the fate of reformers in other European courts. In England, King Henry VIII's break with Rome had initially seemed to offer hope for religious reform, but recent developments suggested that Henry's approach was creating as much danger for reformers as the old Catholic orthodoxy. In Germany, the peasant uprisings, inspired partly by religious reform, as Marie worked oil of lavender through Marguerite's hair, a luxury that demonstrated both her wealth, Marguerite confided her fears about her own safety. Several prominent nobles had already been investigated by the Inquisition for suspected heretical beliefs, and she knew that her own writings and associations had not gone unnoticed by church authorities. Only her brother's protection, and her own political value as Queen of Navarre. The evening meal served in Marguerite's chambers reflected both her elevated status. Tonight's supper included white bread made from wheat grown on her own estates, cheese aged in the caves beneath her castle in Navarre, and wine from vineyards that had been in her family for generations. But even this simple meal carried political implications. The wheat had to be tested for spoilage. That could indicate deliberate contamination. As she ate, Marguerite reviewed correspondence that had arrived throughout the day, including coded letters from religious reformers throughout Europe, diplomatic communications from various courts, and personal messages from her daughter Jean, who was being raised at the French court under conditions that were partially protective and partially hostage-like. Each letter required careful analysis, not just for its explicit content, but for the political undercurrents. One particular letter that evening brought both hope and worry. It came from her correspondent in the German states, where Protestant reforms were taking hold, despite violent opposition The letter, written in a cipher that Marguerite had learned from Italian diplomats, described new theological writings that aligned closely with her own developing beliefs about salvation and the role of individual conscience in religious matters. But the same letter also contained warnings about the reach of Catholic investigation networks, which had apparently identified several French nobles as supporters of reform movements. The letter's author advised extreme caution and suggested Marguerite might need to distance herself from certain associates whose continued friendship could compromise her safety. As her ladies prepared her bed with the usual elaborate ritual of layered coverlets and carefully arranged pillows, Marguerite made decisions that would affect not just her own fate, but the future of religious reform in France. She decided to send secret funding to support reformers who had been forced to flee to more tolerant regions, understanding that this action would further expose her to accusations of heresy if discovered. She also resolved to begin preparing coded copies of her own religious writings to be hidden in various locations. The bed itself, a massive construction of carved oak, draped with tapestries, became the stage for Marguerite's evening prayers, which had evolved far from the traditional Catholic liturgy of her youth. Instead of simply reciting memorized Latin phrases, she engaged in personal meditation that reflected her growing belief in individual spiritual responsibility. Her prayers this evening included petitions for the safety of reformers throughout Europe, requests for wisdom in navigating the dangerous political currents that surrounded her, and personal appeals for the strength to continue her work despite growing risks. She prayed for her daughter Jean, who would someday inherit both tremendous political power and the dangerous religious convictions Marguerite was carefully instilling in her through coded letters and secret visits. As she settled beneath the heavy fur coverlets, Marguerite was acutely aware of the sounds that filled the night around her castle. Unlike the peaceful countryside setting of most noble residences, the Chateau d'Amboise was surrounded by the constant activity of a royal court, guards changing shifts with military precision, and the various servants and officials who kept the complex machinery of royal administration functioning through the night. But tonight, these familiar sounds carried additional meaning. As Marguerite recognized the footsteps of particular individuals whose presence might indicate shifting political currents. The arrival of certain courtiers could signal new developments in the ongoing conflicts between France and the Holy Roman Empire, while the departure of others might suggest changes in royal favor. The hours before sleep were filled with the kind of strategic thinking that had kept Marguerite alive. She mentally reviewed her alliances, considered potential threats, and planned her responses to various scenarios that might unfold in the coming days. Her survival depended not just on her royal blood, but on her ability to anticipate and adapt to the rapidly changing political landscape of Renaissance Europe. As sleep finally approached, Marguerite's thoughts turned to the legacy she hoped to leave through her writings and her influence on religious reform movements. She understood that her privileged position came with responsibilities that extended far beyond personal comfort. Her nightly preparations weren't simply about rest, but about steeling herself for another day of walking, the dangerous line between public conformity and private conviction. The candlelight that illuminated her final prayers cast dancing shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to echo the uncertainties that would follow her into sleep and return with her to the challenges of another day at the most dangerous court in Europe. The mystery of the anchoresses, medieval women who chose living death. As we leave behind the dangerous splendor of Marguerite's court, let us travel now, one that challenges everything we might assume about women's choices in the Middle Ages. Imagine, if you will, a chamber, a room that served as both bedroom and tomb, where women voluntarily chose to spend their final years in a form of living death that has puzzled historians for centuries. In the autumn of 1413, in the English town of King's Lynn, a small stone cell was being sealed shut, with a living woman inside. Dame Julian of Norwich, already renowned as a mystic and spiritual guide, had made a choice that to modern minds seems almost incomprehensible. She had decided to become an anchoress, to have herself walled into a tiny chamber where she would remain until her death. Decades later, this wasn't imprisonment or punishment, but a deliberate spiritual choice made by hundreds of medieval women across Europe. A practice so widespread and yet so alien to our modern understanding that it has become one of the most fascinating mysteries of medieval women's history. Tonight, as we explore the bedtime routines of these extraordinary women, we enter a world where the bedroom became a spiritual laboratory, where sleep and waking merged into a single continuous state of religious contemplation. The process of becoming an anchoress began long before the actual enclosure ceremony. Julian had spent years preparing for this moment, studying religious texts, mastering the complex theological arguments that would guide her enclosed life, and developing the spiritual disciplines that would sustain her through decades. Her decision wasn't made in isolation, but required the approval of church authorities, the support of her local community. The anchor hold itself, the small chamber that would become Julian's entire world, had been constructed according to specifications that had evolved over centuries of anchoritic tradition. The room measured approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, with walls of thick stone that would muffle sound and provide insulation against both cold. 3 small windows provided the anchoresses. The first window, called the squint, opened into the church sanctuary, allowing Julian to observe the daily celebration of Mass. This window was her lifeline to the spiritual community that had chosen to support her extraordinary calling. The second window opened to the outside world, where visitors could come to seek her counsel. The third window provided access to a small garden or courtyard, allowing limited fresh air and natural light. Julian's evening routine was governed by the canonical hours that structured medieval monastic life. As sunset approached, marked not by clocks, but by the changing angle of light, she would begin the complex ritual of Vespers, the evening prayer service that connected her to religious communities throughout the Christian world. But the anchoress's version of evening prayers carried unique elements that reflected the extraordinary nature of her chosen life. Julian's prayers weren't simply recitations, but intense personal communications with the divine that drew on the mystical experiences that had led to her enclosure in the first place. Her most famous visions, which she called showings, had come to her during a period of serious illness, when she believed she was dying. As darkness fell, Julian would prepare her simple bed, covered with woolen blankets donated by supporters in the community. The bed served not just as a place for sleep, but as a location for the kind of intense spiritual contemplation that made anchoresses valued counselors and spiritual guides throughout medieval society. The mystery that continues to fascinate modern scholars, but actually thrived, producing some of the most sophisticated theological and mystical literature of the Middle Ages. Julian's own writings, dictated through her window to scribes and eventually compiled into revelations of divine love, represent the first known work written by a woman in English. And their theological sophistication suggests a level of intellectual activity that challenges common assumptions about medieval women's education and capabilities. Archaeological investigations of anchor holds throughout England and Europe have revealed surprising details about the daily lives of these enclosed women. Excavations at several sites have uncovered evidence of sophisticated systems for waste disposal, food storage, and even small-scale craft production that allowed anchoresses to contribute to their communities' economic life while maintaining their religious solitude. At one anchor hold in Norwich, archaeologists discovered a complex system of clay pipes that carried waste away from the cell, along with evidence of a small but efficient kitchen area, where the anchoress could prepare simple meals from ingredients passed through her window. The presence of high-quality ceramic vessels, metal tools, and even imported goods suggest that some anchoresses maintain surprisingly comfortable living conditions, despite their voluntary confinement. Perhaps most intriguingly, excavations have revealed evidence that many anchor holds were connected by underground passages or shared wall systems that may have allowed communication between different anchoresses in the same town or region. This discovery has led some historians to speculate that the anchoritic movement may have functioned as an informal network of women scholars and spiritual advisors, connected despite their apparent isolation. Julian's evening routine included not just personal prayer and contemplation, but also preparation for the next day's counseling sessions, with visitors who would come to her window seeking spiritual guidance. Medieval records show that anchoresses were consulted on everything from personal spiritual crises, and their advice was sought by people from all levels of society. The process of preparing for these consultations required Julian to maintain extensive mental libraries of scriptural passages, theological arguments, and practical wisdom about human nature and spiritual development. Her evening hours were spent reviewing and organizing this knowledge, often through techniques of memory training that allowed medieval scholars to retain vast amounts of information without written notes. As Julian prepared for sleep, she engaged in spiritual practices that blurred the boundaries between waking and sleeping consciousness. Medieval mystics often reported receiving their most important revelations during the liminal states between sleep and waking, and anchoresses, like Julian, deliberately cultivated these altered states of consciousness as part of their spiritual discipline. The physical environment of the anchor hold contributed to these experiences. The constant dim lighting, the restricted sensory input, and the repetitive daily routine created conditions that modern researchers recognize as conducive to the kind of mystical experiences that Julian and other anchoresses reported. The cell itself functioned as a form of sensory deprivation chamber, allowing the anchoress to focus entirely on interior spiritual experiences. Julian's bedtime prayers included not just personal petitions, but intercessions for the entire community that supported her anchoretic calling. She prayed for her patrons, the wealthy individuals whose donations supported her basic needs, for the church officials who had approved her enclosure, and for the countless visitors who would come to her window seeking guidance and consolation. But the central mystery of Julian's nightly routines centered on her ongoing relationship with the mystical experiences that had shaped her calling. Her showings hadn't been single events, but part of an ongoing process of revelation that continued throughout her decades of enclosure. Many of her most profound theological insights came to her during the quiet hours of night, when the distractions of daily visitors and routine prayers gave way to deeper contemplation. The question that continues to puzzle scholars is how women like Julian developed such sophisticated theological understanding, despite having no formal access to university education or extensive libraries. The evidence suggests that anchoresses created their own informal systems of education, sharing books and ideas through networks of supporters and possibly communicating with each other through methods left little historical trace. Archaeological evidence from various anchor holds has revealed the presence of books, writing materials, and other indicators of literary activity, suggesting that many anchoresses were not just consumers of religious knowledge, but active contributors to medieval intellectual life. At Julian's anchor hold in Norwich, excavations uncovered fragments of multiple manuscripts, ink stains on stone surfaces that suggests extensive writing activity. The mystery deepens when we consider the influence that anchoresses wielded despite their apparent powerlessness. Julian's theological writings were copied and circulated throughout Europe, influencing religious thought for centuries after her death. Other anchoresses served as informal advisors to political leaders, with some medieval chronicles recording instances where kings and nobles made important decisions based on counsel received through anchorholds' windows. As Julian settled into her simple bed each night, surrounded by the stone walls that would contain her for the rest of her life, she represented a form of female empowerment that operated entirely outside the conventional structures of medieval society. By choosing apparent powerlessness, she had gained a form of authority that was unavailable to women. Motherhood and household management. The sounds that filled Julian's nights were different from those experienced by other medieval women. Instead of the domestic noises of castle life, or the urban sounds of merchant households, her evenings were marked by the distant chanting of monastic offices, the footsteps of night pilgrims visiting the church, and the subtle sounds of stone and wood settling in the ancient building that housed her cell. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of anchoritic sleep was the way these women reported experiencing divine communication. Julian's own writings describe revelations that came to her during sleep, visions that she carefully analyzed and interpreted upon waking, adding to the growing body of theological insight that would eventually make her one of the most influential religious writers of her era. Recent archaeological discoveries have added new layers to the mystery of anchoritic life, revealing evidence that these women maintained surprisingly sophisticated daily routines despite their extreme isolation. Excavations at a 14th century anchor hold in Winchester, suggesting that anchoresses like Julian served not only as spiritual counselors, as informal medical practitioners for their communities. The presence of dried lavender, chamomile, and other medicinal plants indicates that their evening preparations, the discovery of small looms and spinning wheels in several anchors, has revealed another dimension of their nightly activities. These women apparently spent their evening hours engaged in textile production, creating altar cloths, vestments, and other religious items The quality of these textiles, evidenced by surviving fragments found in church treasuries. Perhaps, most mysteriously, may actually have been authored by the linguistic patterns and theological perspectives found in these texts, suggesting that the intellectual influence of the Anchoritic movement may have been far greater. The psychological aspects of Anchoritic sleep remain one of the most intriguing elements of this medieval phenomenon. Modern sleep researchers have noted that the conditions within with their limited light exposure and highly regulated daily rhythms, would have produced significant changes. Some scholars theorize that the mystical visions reported by anchoresses may have been related to altered sleep, cycles that created particularly vivid and memorable dream states. Julian's own descriptions of her nighttime experiences suggest a form of consciousness that moved fluidly. She wrote of receiving divine communications during what she called when her mind was freed from the ordinary concerns of daily life and opened to spiritual insights that would have been impossible in a conventional medieval household. The phenomenon of Anchoritic women challenges many of our assumptions about medieval life, revealing a world where religious conviction could create opportunities for intellectual achievement, spiritual authority, and personal autonomy that were otherwise unavailable to women. As Julian prepared for sleep each night in her tiny cell, she embodied a mystery that continues to fascinate historians and theologians, a puzzle about the nature of choice, freedom, and spiritual experience that defies easy categorization. The luxurious night world of Byzantine empresses. From the austere stone cell of Julian of Norwich, let us journey now to the opposite extreme of medieval women's experiences. Traveling eastward to Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire, where the bedtime preparations of imperial women represented the pinnacle of medieval luxury. Here, in the most opulent court of the medieval world, sleep itself became a performance of power. In the year 1055, within the sacred halls of the great palace of Constantinople, Empress Theodora Porphyrogenita prepared for what would become her final year of life as the sole ruler of the Byzantine Empire. At 76 years old, she was the last member of the Macedonian dynasty. A woman who had wielded absolute power over an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates, and her evening preparations reflected not just personal luxury, but the elaborate ceremonial requirements of an office. The Empress's bedchamber, located in the most secure section of the sacred palace, was a marvel of medieval engineering and artistic achievement that surpassed anything found in Western Europe. The walls were covered with mosaics, created by the empire's finest artists, depicting scenes from Christian scripture rendered in gold leaf and precious stones that caught and reflected the light, suspended from the ceiling by chains of silver and bronze. The preparation for Theodora's bedtime began hours before she would actually retire, involving a complex choreography of servants, officials, and ceremonial activities that reflected the Byzantine belief that the emperor or empress served as God's representative on earth. Every aspect of the imperial evening routine was governed by protocols established over centuries, recorded in detailed manuals that specified not just what should be done. The first phase of the evening ritual involved the formal dismissal of the day's court activities. Unlike Western medieval courts, where the transition from public to private life was relatively informal, The Byzantine court required elaborate ceremonies to mark each change in the emperor's daily routine. Theodora's evening began with the ceremony of the Great Retirement, during which the most senior court officials would formally request permission to withdraw from the imperial presence. This ceremony took place in the Hall of the 19 Couches, one of the palace's most magnificent reception rooms, where Theodora sat on a throne elevated 7 steps above the assembled courtiers. The throne itself was a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship, carved from ivory and sapphires arranged in patterns that told the story of Byzantine imperial history. Mechanical devices hidden within the throne's structure could make golden lions at its base appear to roar, and golden birds in nearby trees seemed to sing, demonstrations of technological sophistication that amazed foreign ambassadors and reinforced the aura of divine authority that surrounded the imperial office. As the court ceremony concluded, Theodora would rise and process through a series of increasingly private chambers, each transition marked by specific rituals and attended by different categories of servants. The Byzantine court was organized according to elaborate hierarchies that determined who could see the emperor in various states of undress, with the most trusted servants earning the privilege of attending the imperial bedtime preparations. The journey from the public throne room to the private bedchamber required passage through 7 different chambers, each serving specific ceremonial and practical functions. In the first chamber, called the Hall of the Candidates, Theodora would pause for the evening's intelligence briefings, receiving reports from the empire's extensive network of spies and diplomats. The Byzantine Empire maintained the most sophisticated intelligence service in the medieval world. In the second chamber, the Hall of the Executors, Theodora would review. The Byzantine bureaucracy was legendary for its complexity and efficiency, managing everything from tax collection in distant provinces. As Empress, Theodora personally reviewed and approved major policy decisions, and her evening administrative session often lasted for hours, as she worked through documents written in multiple languages and dealing with issues that affected millions of subjects. The third chamber, known as the Chrysotraklinos, or Golden Hall, served as the location for the evening's religious observances. Unlike Western medieval rulers, who typically attended religious services in chapel buildings separate from their palaces, Byzantine emperors incorporated religious rituals directly into their daily court routine. The evening service included prayers for the empire's continued prosperity. The religious ceremony in the Chrysotraklinos revealed one of the most distinctive aspects of Byzantine imperial ideology. The empress wasn't simply a political ruler who happened to be Christian, but was understood to serve as Christ's vicegerent on earth, responsible not just for temporal governance. This belief shaped every aspect of Theodora's evening routine, as her personal preparations for sleep were understood to have cosmic significance for the empire's continued prosperity. The fourth chamber began the transition to more intimate spaces, where only the most trusted servants were permitted to attend the empress. Here, the formal court robes that had marked Theodora's public appearances throughout the day. These weren't simply expensive clothes, but sacred vestments that embodied imperial authority. The removal of each piece followed prescribed rituals, with specific prayers and ceremonial actions that recognized the spiritual significance. Theodora's court robes represented the pinnacle of medieval textile art, incorporating silk from China, gold thread from workshops in Constantinople, pearls from the Persian Gulf, and precious stones from mines throughout the empire. The main imperial robe, called the lauros, was so heavy with gold embroidery and jeweled decoration that it required the assistance of multiple servants to remove safely. The purple silk that formed the base of the garment was dyed with murex shells harvested from specific locations in the Mediterranean as the formal robes were removed. Theodora's body servants began the elaborate bathing ritual that prepared her for the night's rest. The Byzantine court had maintained and refined the bathing traditions inherited from ancient Rome, and the imperial bath complex within the sacred palace. The bathing process involved multiple pools maintained at different temperatures, scented oils imported from across the empire. The evening bath served practical, ceremonial, and spiritual purposes. Practically, it provided cleansing and relaxation after the demanding schedule of imperial duties. Ceremonially, it marked the transition from public emperor to private person, a symbolic washing away of the day's responsibilities. Spiritually, it reflected Christian beliefs about purification. The bath oils used in Theodora's evening routine represented a global trade network that connected Constantinople to producers in India, Ceylon, Arabia, and Africa. Rose oil from Bulgarian monasteries, sandalwood oil from Indian merchants, and frankincense from Ethiopian traders were blended according to secret recipes maintained by the imperial perfumers. The resulting combinations but were believed to have medicinal properties that promoted health and longevity. As the bathing ritual concluded, Byzantine court fashion required elaborate hairstyles that incorporated jeweled hairpins, silk ribbons, and small golden ornaments, and the evening routine involved the careful removal. The empress's hair itself, now grey with age, but still thick and long, was brushed with combs made from ivory and silver, then braided. The preparation of the imperial bedchamber represented another level of complexity that distinguished Byzantine court life from its Western counterparts. The bed itself was constructed on a raised platform that elevated it above the level of the surrounding floor, symbolically reinforcing the empress's elevated status, even during sleep. The mattress was filled with down from swans and geese, raised specifically for imperial use, covered with silk sheets that were changed daily, and embroidered with imperial symbols in gold thread. The bedchamber's temperature was carefully regulated through a sophisticated heating system that channeled warm air through hypocausts built into the walls and floors. This technology, inherited from Roman engineering traditions, allowed the imperial apartments to maintain comfortable temperatures, even during Constantinople's, when temperatures in the unheated sections of the palace could drop below freezing. Security arrangements for the imperial bedchamber reflected the constant dangers that surrounded Byzantine rulers. The chamber itself was accessible only through a single doorway, which was guarded throughout the night by members of the Varangian Guard, elite warriors recruited from Scandinavia and Russia, whose loyalty was secured through generous payments and the honor of serving the emperor directly. Additional security measures included secret passages that could provide escape routes in case of palace coups. As Theodora finally settled into her elaborate bed, surrounded by silk curtains, her evening prayers reflected the unique position she occupied in medieval Christian thought. Unlike Western rulers, who were understood to be temporal authorities, Byzantine emperors were believed to share in divine authority itself. serving as earthly representatives of Christ's heavenly kingdom. The Empress's final prayers of the evening included petitions for the continued prosperity of the empire, requests for divine guidance in future policy decisions, and personal appeals for the strength to bear the enormous responsibilities of imperial office. But they also included prayers that revealed the human side of a woman who had spent decades wielding absolute power in a world where political mistakes could result in death, exile, or the destruction of entire dynasties. As sleep approached, Theodora was attended by a select group of women ready to respond to any imperial needs that might arise. These attendants, chosen for their absolute loyalty and discretion, represented families that had served the imperial court for generations, and their presence provided both practical assistance and emotional support for a ruler whose position required constant vigilance. The sounds that filled Theodora's final moments of consciousness were unique to the Byzantine court. The measured footsteps of guards patrolling the corridors, the whisper of silk curtains moving in the carefully regulated air currents, and the subtle mechanical sounds of the water clocks that marked the passage of time in a palace, where every moment was carefully measured and accounted for. In this final segment of our journey through medieval women's bedtime experiences, we see the ultimate expression of power and luxury available to women in the medieval world, but also the ultimate isolation and responsibility. Theodora's elaborate evening preparations remind us that even at the pinnacle of medieval society, the transition from waking to sleeping carried profound meaning, shaped by beliefs about power. As our journey through the evening worlds of medieval noblewomen comes to a close, we've travelled from the practical concerns of an English baroness, from the spiritual mysteries of religious enclosure, to the imperial splendour of Byzantine court life. Each of these women, separated by centuries and continents, shared the common human experience of preparing for sleep, yet their bedtime routines reveal the remarkable diversity of women's lives in the medieval world. These stories remind us that the past was neither uniformly oppressive, but rather a complex tapestry of human experiences shaped by the specific circumstances of time. In the quiet moments before sleep, these medieval women navigated the same fundamental human needs for safety, comfort, and meaning that continue to shape our own evening routines today. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the intimate histories of medieval women's lives. As you prepare for your own rest tonight, creativity and dignity that these women brought to their daily lives, even in circumstances that seem almost unimaginably different from our own. I hope these stories have brought you the peaceful contemplation you were seeking. Sweet dreams, and until we meet again in the quiet corners of history, may your own sleep be filled with the kind of rest that these remarkable women of the past would have envied. If you enjoyed this exploration, please remember to share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what other aspects of medieval life you'd like us to explore together in future journeys